cordially welcome our dear friend Noëlle Vahanian. He is also our guest in this conference. She's professor of philosophy at Lebanon Valley College. She is the co-author of one recent book published by Columbia called Four New Gospels, Insurrectionist Manifesto. But as I hear, you're working on genocides now mainly, and this lecture will be more in this direction.
Indeed.
So, next 45 minutes, and then we have 15 minutes for discussion, maybe 20, and that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for your generous hearing of my paper today. Thank you for your kind patience also with me today. Right. So let me start with my tentative proposal, which is to say something so as not to say nothing, at the risk of being misunderstood, and worse, of making enemies. This is a difficult burden to assume and to risk such a thinking without having clear sight and the answers to the difficult questions one raises. It's perhaps reckless. To dare to question like a pupil in a classroom, raising her hand without supreme authority or expertise, those value-laden ideas and thinkers on the apparent good side of history is likely foolish. But this is where I stand in my search for a thinking that does not disappoint, a theological thinking, in the face of the angel of history. The current rise of ethno-nationalisms and religious fundamentalisms, and a continuum of hate, violence, and oppression on this earth into which everyone comes into being. What then is the logic of the exceptional event as ethical model, the root cause of the Levinasian imperative to put ethics before ontology, the most important question of philosophy? Why, as Levinas averred to Dussel, had he never considered that the other could signify the non-European oppressed others? Or why, as Butler puzzled too, would he go on to say that the Palestinian has no face? Can the Holocaust, understood or conceived as unique in history, as an exceptional historical event, give license to a perverse moral high ground, one such through which, for instance, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict can be interpreted, but also one through which denialism, the denial of genocide, and revisionist history collude in the maintenance of identity politics? In other words, is ethics ever outside of history? And if not, how can it ever be prior to ontology? Should we not instead rethink ontology? Would an ontology of becoming, a plastic ontology, offer an alternative understanding of one's responsibility to the face of the other? One that would live within totality, not in despair of not knowing the eternal, not eminently undone, infinitely undone, but instead more like Sisyphus, shackled to his rock, a totality that risks crushing him unless he keeps at his infinite task. I would like to situate these questions before engaging them, since we are here questioning the encroaching limits of philosophy into religion and vice versa, and since I'm here sitting on a limit between ethics and ontology, wondering if it is a limit at all, and what insisting on those limits as real and important might be corrupting, besides perhaps a false hope that we are ever grounded in the idea of the infinite, or ever authentically undone and irresolute in our identities. Or worse, that some, like the victim once and for all, might even be nearer this infinite undoing than others, as if an ethical privileged position did not completely contravene the encounter with the face of the other. I would like to situate these questions at the crossroads of two histories. The first is that of post-death of God radical theology, the theological movement spawned from the 60s era as many were reeling from the human toll of total war and genocide, awakening to civil rights struggles, and some might say confirming the secularization thesis. During this time period, Time magazine featured its first text-only cover with the emblazoned question, "Is God dead?" And for some, after Auschwitz or Hiroshima, God was dead, so that a new ethical paradigm holding the Holocaust as the unrepeatable exception, as the model whose copy is forbidden, took hold in place of the old God. Never again, said the survivors, never again, replied the bystanders. In continental philosophy, Emmanuel Levinas established ethics as first philosophy before ontology, the classical question of being. More primordial than that there's something rather than nothing is the face of the other, to whom we each are infinitely responsible. Thus the West began to understand itself as post-Holocaust, pro-human rights, and as a beacon of democracy. The second history meeting this first one is my own, as the granddaughter of survivors of the 1915 Armenian Genocide by the Ottoman Turks during the period of World War I. Turkey still denies that what happened constituted genocide. Whatever happened was not a unique event, but instead it was what happens again and again in the cruel theater of war. It is this historical situatedness that therefore leads me to ask whether the logic of the exceptional event as ethical model lends credibility to denialism. The Palestinian has no face, say the ones. Armenians are liars, say the others. Does the violence of denialism lurk even in this ethical vision as a form of speech that denies the unrecognizable other's speech in the name of the face of the other? Let me therefore begin by painting a picture of denialism from most simple to most complex in an attempt to answer these questions or to disentangle the ethical vision from what might be an unintended effect or instead a corruption of the vision. Such a distortion of the ethical vision would be comparable to the more famous distortion of the Kantian ethic, which the Nazi war criminal Adolf Eichmann famously invoked in his defense before the Israeli court that hung him to death. What is denialism? Perhaps what most readily comes to mind to most Westerners is Holocaust denialism, the denial that Nazi policies led to the intentional extermination of 6 million European Jews over the period of the Second World War. One can imagine various ways in which the denial can take form, from denying the factuality to the intent of the said criminal actions. Accordingly, historical negationism is a form of denialism. People can read the diary of Anne Frank and come to different conclusions. In the West, the diary is a canonical text of Holocaust educational curricula, but some may read it and question its authenticity, as Holocaust denier Robert Faurisson has. And perhaps then there are also those who may use it as propaganda, as North Korea has against the United States, and the debate would be up whether such use constitutes a form of Holocaust denial in shifting the blame from the Nazis to the Bush U.S. regime. There are various forms, then, of denialism. Some are blatant and malevolent, while others are innocent and come in the form of basic ignorance, incredulity, or even in the name of intellectual freedom and the pursuit of truth. Somewhere in between, however, are those who deny being deniers and hide their racist agenda behind their scholarship, as David Irving, who famously brought an unsuccessful libel case against Holocaust historian Deborah Lipstadt, and whom the English courts found, to the contrary, to be motivated by racist and anti-Semitic sentiments. My audience here today is aware that many European countries have established anti-Holocaust denial laws. The rationale for these laws is to prevent more genocidal violence and to preserve the dignity of the victims, as the last stage in genocide is, precisely, its denial. If denialism is an illegitimate distortion of the historical record, perhaps one of its most trenchant forms is that which is instituted by law, where the law functions as a gag order on those whose historical record might impugn the sovereignty of a state or tarnish national identity. Denialism is not only legitimate, it is the law of the land. It is not denialism at all, would view all contraries' views as negationists. Denial is still the official position of the Turkish Republic, whose founder, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, was also the consummator of the Armenian Genocide in 1922. And this latter point can't be underestimated. Article 301 of the Turkish Penal Code prohibits insulting the Turkish nation and Turkey's governmental institutions. According to a 2011 ruling of the European Court of Human Rights, this article of the Criminal Code is too broad to function as a law, and in this way threatens Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights, providing the rights to freedom of expression and information. This despite the 2008 amendment to Article 301, replacing the initial wording for the offense, namely denigration of Turkishness, with denigration of the Turkish nation. Orhan Pamuk, Hrant Dink, and Taner Aksam, to name a few, have suffered governmental reprisals and indictments or fear thereof for their public recognition of the Armenian genocide. It's also noteworthy to mention that Article 301 was newly minted in 2005 to replace Article 159 of 1926 within the context of legal reforms presented on the occasion of Turkey's postulation to the European Union. Talks for Turkish accession have come to a halt since the 2016 military coup by the Erdogan regime. And if a European court would point to the unconstitutional excesses of such a law, assuredly then a similar law would be unthinkable today in a European country. And yet, to the contrary, one can call to mind the recent 2018 Polish decision to criminalize the ascription of responsibility to the Polish nation for any Holocaust-related crimes, the law serving to autocorrect the putative defamatory misnaming of extermination camps established on Polish grounds as Polish death camps. Those condemning the law suggest it institutionalizes Holocaust denial, ostensibly exculpating all Poles of any complicity in the Holocaust. Lending weight to this contention is the rise of right-wing, populist, socially conservative, so-called Eurosceptic Law and Justice Party that has majority power since 2015. In both of these examples, the law institutes a kind of violence against memory or remembering, forces amnesia, never remember or misremember, not the same as forgetting. This seems to be the violence product of a strong ontology, or rather a precarious sense of identity in search of a strong national ontology. At the same time, consider, however, that while Israel recalled its diplomatic corps over the Polish law, it has yet to officially recognize the Armenian genocide. While what may readily come to mind for this is the obvious geopolitical interests of Israel, one can also point to its own Holocaust educational curriculum. Israeli Holocaust and Genocide Studies historian Yair Oran, in an interview with Haaretz, has decried the unilateral or exclusive focus of Israel's Holocaust education at the expense of other victims of the Nazi Holocaust and other genocides. Quote, "It must be asked if, in Israel in 2016, instead of also shaping Holocaust commemoration through humanist and democratic values, it is unknowingly, and perhaps for many knowingly, fostering racism and xenophobia," end quote. When the oft-repeated claim that the Holocaust is unique comes without the ability to name any other great suffering, this betrays a form of instituted ignorance. Likewise, when the Armenian genocide is omitted from Turkish history books and a revised version presents Armenians as political traitors or as war victims in the same way that Turks were also war victims, we may ask whether this too fosters racism and xenophobia. In fact, in an unseemly alliance, the Turkish state undermined the factual claim of the Armenian genocide in a libel Supreme Court case at the European Court of Human Rights by invoking the uniqueness of the Holocaust. The European jurors ruled in favor of the Turkish defendant, not on the basis that the Swiss lower chamber had infringed on his freedom of expression when it convicted him for spreading anti-Armenian sentiment, but instead because there were no gas chambers to vindicate the Swiss point of view that the defendant had engaged in Armenian genocide denial speech. Of course, the problematic assumption some might see in the above juxtaposition is that the ultimate culprit at this juncture of Turkey's own denialism is the insistence that the Holocaust was unique. The claim is appropriated by Armenian genocide deniers, but it can be precisely because the State of Israel is a complicit in the same denial. My contention, however, is that the narrative of uniqueness, dependent as it is on the essentialized particularism of national or ethnic or even personal identity, can only be carried on eventually through an imaginative or constituted historical memorialization. I don't think that enshrining this claim will warrant against the perverse spread of Holocaust denialism, because that very claim is used towards denialist aims, as suggested above in the case of the Armenian genocide. And what I do want to warn against is the perverse use of this claim, knowingly or not, towards denialism and revisionist history, whether it is used to fend off criticisms of the State of Israel or to minimize other genocides. But at the same time, I am fully aware that my caution might be seen as a case of Holocaust denialism or anti-Semitism, precisely because that very contention also belongs to the denier's playbook. It's horrifying. In 2017, Deborah Lipstadt wrote a column for The Atlantic deploring the White House's treatment on the occasion of Holocaust Remembrance Day for its omitting the mention of anti-Semitism and Jews. As she put it, the statement bemoaned instead the innocent victims. Lipstadt qualified as softcore Holocaust denial both the statement as well as a defense of the statement by a White House representative who claimed that the omission was intended in an effort to be more inclusive of the other victims of the Nazis. I would agree that the White House statement is duplicitous, crafted to appeal to a fringe Trump base. But for Lipstadt, the semantics are as clear as the facts, while homosexuals or Roma or resistance fighters were also persecuted by the Nazi regime. These are the other victims she mentions. Only the Jews were the victims of systematic extermination campaigns. And this is why the Holocaust refers exclusively to the 6 million European Jews who were killed for no other reason than that they were Jews. Softcore Holocaust denial is also a term she applies to those who would suggest that, quote, Jews use the Holocaust to draw attention away from criticism of Israel, or to those who would dare to compare Soviet-era atrocities with Nazi crimes, and who in so doing rehabilitate Nazi war criminals into anti-communist heroes. Her article tags a Lithuanian case in which former Nazis are rehabilitated into heroes, while communist resistance fighters such as Holocaust historian Yitzhak Arad face charges for their alleged Stalin-era war crimes. For Lipstadt, as evidence in this case as well as in the White House statement, the word genocide can only serve, to sweep under the rug and in effect justify anti-Semitic sentiment such that the Holocaust is de-Judaized. Elsewhere, Lipstadt's view of what she terms softcore denial, and which in the West has begun to supersede blatant denial, entails, besides the opinion that, quote, one hears too much about the Holocaust, Muslim versions of anti-Semitism, the argument that Israel is committing genocide against the Palestinians, the claim that the Holocaust is equivalent to other genocides, end quote. Dovid Katz, who maintains the webpage defendinghistory.com out of Vilnius, Lithuania, and who was referenced in the tagged article on the Lithuanian case, warns of the Eastern European manifestation of this phenomenon. His view in the aforementioned article is recapitulated as follows, quote, Lithuania and other Eastern European countries are embracing a double genocide theory that posits that both the Nazis and Soviets committed genocide. What the hypothesis lacks in intellectual honesty, it makes up for in political expediency. By positing twin genocides, Lithuanians become victims and Judeo-Bolsheviks become perpetrators in a second mirror image Holocaust, end quote. Nevertheless, prominently figured on one of the walls of the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., are Hitler's words, spoken to the Wehrmacht 1 week before the invasion of Poland, quote, who, after all, speaks today of the annihilation of the Armenians. He was justifying his intent to create Lebensraum through the destruction of the enemy to the east and referencing his orders to, quote, send to death mercilessly and without compassion men, women, and children of Polish derivation and language, end quote. Warsaw's blueprint is a testament to this form of genocidal intent. At the same time, with the Nazi invasion of Poland, Lithuania, since this is the case with which we began, was transferred over to the Soviet sphere of influence. Repressive Soviet occupation began soon thereafter, so that some would view the Nazi invasion of 1941 as a form of liberation, in the mirror form of those who viewed the Red Army as liberators. The fact that the Soviet Union regained control and annexed Lithuania seems today to cement the perverse twin genocide view, and it does verily obfuscate the fact that the Holocaust was carried out with greater efficiency in Lithuania, precisely because Lithuanians were themselves at the forefront of the initial waves of mass executions. Similarly, in Poland, the double occupation, Nazi to the west, Soviets to the east, assuredly preconized a Polish ethnocide. Poles do feel a double victim complex, which is a complex because it goes largely unrecognized or minimized by the West, whose Europeanization of memory entails foremost both the recognition of the Holocaust as a quintessential form of evil that ought never happen again, and an emphasis on the defense of human rights worldwide to vindicate the injunction. One could postulate that it is this double victim complex that is resurfacing in the symptomatic form of the 2018 Polish populist law enshrining a legal form of anti-Semitism. Softcore Holocaust denial seems then to work the same as white privilege denial, that which, for instance, is manifest in the counter-movement to Black Lives Matter, namely All Lives Matter. Resentment writ large, except that from this Europeanization of memory perspective, slavery, segregation, and even lynching cannot be compared with the horrors of the Holocaust, and the effect of today's racism bear no profound similarity to Nazi racist eliminationist policies. The record of institutional, systemic violence of a police complex against minorities, as evident in the US, for instance, while deplorable, doesn't reflect a policy of systematic state violence. One cannot point to a direct order to charge African Americans disparate sentences in comparison to whites for similar offenses, or to incarcerate African Americans 5 times more than whites. While it is clear, I agree, that such incarceration cannot compare with a progression from lethal discrimination and segregation to ghettoization and mass extermination, it would also be wrong to reject altogether any comparison whatsoever. One could suggest with equal integrity to those who charge that comparisons of other atrocities with the Holocaust minimizes it, that the incomparability of the Holocaust in effect here potentially minimizes white institutional racism, absolves it. Blacks were taken from their ancestral lands, disenfranchised, forced into unpaid labor, hot-ironed or tattooed, renamed, forbidden from marrying whites, and treated as commodified and violable bodies. But those who reject any comparison would retort that because all this served an instrumental and economic purpose, because blacks were not simply or directly killed because they were blacks, we should not conflate the evil of slavery with that of genocide. And with that same reasoning, they would further argue we cannot impugn colonialism, as Aimé Césaire, for instance, would have done, as precursor to the Holocaust, or as he put it, the Holocaust is boomerang effect of colonialism. To do so is, for some, to deal in denialism or anti-Semitism. I would argue, however, that the problem with the limit event as unsayable and incomparable goes both ways. In any comparison, the limit event loses its exceptionality, and if that is what renders it radically evil, unrepeatable, then its evil is minimized and banal. But likewise, however, any other episode of human calamity, even other recognized genocides, are also minimized when they cannot approach the limit that is the exception. Debates on this very issue take different turns according to what is understood by unique. Does the Holocaust uniqueness mean it's a quasi-historical event, or is it unique in a historical chain of unique moments? Is the uniqueness relative to the particular identity it negates, so that it would be impossible for people with Jewish identity to experience the Holocaust otherwise than as unique, and any comparison represents a mode of denialism? Aimé Césaire's piece was written when he was still a member of the Communist Party. He reneged his appurtenance a year after the piece was published. The piece speaks of the decivilizing effect of colonialism on the colonizers, who showed no qualms in applying humanist standards with a double standard, that is, exclusive of those they deemed to belong to the inferior races. For Césaire, however, the primary culprit in the so-called civilizing colonial enterprise is not European culture or humanism as such, but the way in which Christianity and capitalism have colluded to produce the thingification and the dehumanization of non-Christian peoples. This violent disregard for the humanity and cultures of the colonized came home to roost in Nazi Germany, the country of Goethe, Beethoven, Kant. Towards the end of the piece, Césaire warns of the peril yet of turning to North American imperialism, its spirit of industrialism, and its neo-colonial tactics for redemption. To do so would be to forsake European civilization altogether. The point of suggesting a comparison between the Holocaust and colonialism is not to minimize the former. It is instead to suggest another point of origin for the event itself. Not one that de-amplifies the responsibility of Nazi Germany, though one that implicates more than Nazi Germany in the proverbial evil camp of history. One that does so without, however, relegating the evil of the Holocaust to nothing more than what human beings have done and will keep doing to each other. In the case of Césaire, American domination heralds the mechanization of man and the gigantic rape of everything intimate. It is a machine for crushing, for grinding, for degrading people, his words. To clamor for the revolution as he does may be naive, though his sense of foreboding that now is Europe's last chance and the time to rally together with its former colonies by, quote, undertaking a policy of nationalities, a new policy founded on respect for peoples and cultures, end quote, is prescient. That is, the current rise in populisms allied with ultra-nationalistic or fascistic tendencies might reveal how Western liberalism has been inadequate in undertaking just such policies. To wit, when on her way to visit a center for detained immigrant children, and in full view of the cameras following the international outrage over the treatment of illegal immigrants, Melania Trump wore a relaxed military-style jacket with an emblazoned phrase echoing a Mussolini-era slogan, "I really don't care, do you?" She, a Slovene and a fashion model, could not have been so clueless. But the larger point is that a mega clothing chain who produced the jacket for mass consumption has its finger on the pulse of a growing market. Zara, the Spanish brand in question, has also mass-produced striped shirts with a yellow star, a flowery purse with swastikas, anti-vegan t-shirts, and so forth. The firm is flirting with anti-fascist, anti-racist, anti-conspicuous consumption identity politics. That said, and not without a problem, an old current of hardcore, to borrow the term from Lipstadt, Holocaust denialism or historical revisionism stems or derives or corrupts and hijacks or somehow seduces a leftist ideological current. Such, according to philosopher Ilhan Yakira in his essay Holocaust Denial and the Left, is what explains how the 60s vieille taupe ultra-leftist Parisian bookstore reopened in the 80s under the direction of a certain Pierre Guillaume to become the main disseminator of anti-Semitic and denialist works by Paul Racinier and Robert Faurisson, among others. Guillaume's views, we learn, were largely influenced by a 60s text entitled Auschwitz, the Great Alibi, which suggested that the Holocaust was capitalism's great alibi and that Nazi Germany was its scapegoat villain. Racinier, a Buchenwald and Dora concentration camp survivor, came to deny the exceptional nature of the Nazis' crimes against humanity. He believed that colonialism was equally guilty and that the gas chambers were not used to kill human beings. And Faurisson infamously denied the existence of gas chambers. These are not the only figures that Yakira discusses, but these egregious examples serve to anchor his main thesis that, quote, the Holocaust becomes one of the most effective, widely used arguments in the ideological struggle against Israel, end quote. That is, says Yakira, the leftist ideological perversion or ideology gone mad, his words, is characterized not by its deviation from the norm, but by its, quote, moral bankruptcy, which links the Holocaust to Israel. This means that denialism affects more than those overt deniers, but also those he calls the good Israelis. who have called into question Israel's treatment of the Palestinians, or finally, the whole, quote, community of opprobrium, end quote, whom he characterizes as belonging to a culture of mutual citation, for reading, quote, at one time it was Marx and Trotsky, today the canon includes, for example, the works of Foucault, Hannah Arendt, Carl Schmitt, and Giorgio Agamben, end quote. Denialism is, and I would agree with Yakira in this, all the more dangerous and malevolent for being insidious and subtle. Nor am I disputing that deniers hide behind scholarly research, claims to fairness, or in the name of truth. I'm not disputing either that denialist views may be held unconsciously or unbeknownst to oneself. But I am questioning a moral logic of the exception that appears to fall prey to a slippery slope fallacy. Just because in those egregious cases of hardcore denialism, the denialist ploy used to delegitimize Israel or attack Jewish identity rests on debunking the uniqueness of the Holocaust, this does not mean that any thinker who commits this idea linkage becomes de facto complicit in denialism. The softcore version, also. This, however, is what Yakira argues. For him, Israeli writer Adi Ophir is just as immoral as the authors of denialist tracts, because in his critique of the state of Israel, Ophir impugns the theologization of the Holocaust. Yakira even accuses the historian David Stannard of colluding with Holocaust denial for arguing that the claim of uniqueness makes it that much easier for the world to be oblivious to past and ongoing genocides. Thus it is that the moral injunction never to forget an unspeakable event or an unspeakable evil of unprecedented violence and unthinkable cruelty, where the event read even as an arbitrary event in history, in inscribing itself in history through the universal injunction to remember as a prohibition against its recurrence, opens itself up to denial and further commits to the status of denial any infraction in memory that, rather than forgetting, would remember more or would remember other arbitrary events in history perceived to be no less horrid, and that to remember would make good on the law to never forget unspeakable evil. This can explain, for instance, why Holocaust scholar Yehuda Bauer has debated that a genocide was committed at Srebrenica. For him, what happened there was a case of mass murder. The events did not fit his definition of genocide. It's the scholar's position, and as such it appears innocuous, but whether or not intentionally, it casts a moral judgment on those who would disagree either with the tautological equation of what constitutes genocide with the event of the Holocaust or with the exceptionalism of the Holocaust. Because nothing else compares, they now appear as deniers for insisting, as Stannard does, that what happened to the indigenous peoples of the Americas constitutes genocide, or as the Israeli writer Adi Ophir does, for daring to make comparisons between the state of Israel's treatment of the Palestinians and Nazi Germany's treatment of the Jews. Here then, I have fleshed out a problematic of denialism as speech denying speech, and then of speech denying the denial, and finally, to the heart of our problem, of anti-denial speech denying speech. Some of these denials might stem from simple ignorance. Many, for instance, are ignorant of the fact that Raphael Lemkin invented the neologism genocide to criminalize acts of barbarism and vandalism committed against swaths of cultures, and so to put an end to the impunity of such repeated offenses manifest throughout the annals of history. The subsequent UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide, dated 1948, makes quite clear that many acts besides outright murder constitute genocide, such as serious bodily or mental harm, or transferring children from one group to another. But in the main, denialisms, rooted as they are in essentialized, particularistic identities, are the product of a totalizing discourse that is as such genocidal, that operates on a genocidal continuum. This would also be the case for the anti-denialist speech that denies speech in the name of anti-denialism. If metaphysical atheism should deliver to us in the injunction not to kill, to love, or to never forget, precisely because we do kill, hate, and deny, nevertheless, in conceiving of our infinite responsibility to the stranger, to the widow, and to the orphan as a responsibility to the victim to never forget, which translates into a moralizing logic of uniqueness, metaphysics is theologized again, and history that is arbitrary is, as if, necessitated. Judith Butler, in her Parting Ways, draws a parallel between Levinas's point that ethics is prior to thought, because the injunction not to kill, in the form of the intrusion of the face of the other, prefigures the knowledge that murder is wrong, and Hannah Arendt's point, as she reads her, that philosophical thought issued forth from the heart of one's conscious being, which is always in the world with others, in the world of cohabitation, where the injunction here is that one may never choose who has a right to cohabit the earth, that philosophical thinking prefigures legal reasoning. If the pre-ontological tends to the irresolution of identity, who can receive the injunction cannot be singled out by virtue of her identity in being. It makes sense, therefore, to suppose that the victim is who receives the injunction, except that, and that would be precisely also what animates the felt burden of the survivor as witness, no one can rest in the identity of the victim. One cannot be resolutely victim, perhaps other than in trauma or death. Indeed, this is not antithetical to Levinas, but instead, as argued also by Butler, is logically consistent with his thought. And yet, as she puts it, quote, Levinas's descriptions of the ethical relation require a dispossession of the self that is contravened by his descriptions of Zionism. For instance, Levinas writes, Zionism and the creation of the State of Israel mean for Jewish thought a return to oneself in every sense of the term, and the end of an alienation that lasted 1,000 years, end quote. If the injunction is pre-ontological, then problematically, it can only function to prevent violence when one is open to the face of the other, when one is undone, irresolute in one's identity, when one sees oneself in the one who suffers, sees the other's suffering, recognizes this suffering because she is undone by it. But this is not a given. Indeed, we are many times over blind to the suffering of the other for simply not recognizing this suffering as constitutive of who one is not, of an irresolute identity. It is impossible to be always open and vulnerable to the face of the other to be responsible for all the suffering. Thus, the ethical obligation toward the face of the other, which would seem to obligate us universally, is restricted culturally and geographically, as Butler writes. And this is why Levinas can say that the Palestinian has no face. So it would seem that the Levinasian universal particularism, which serves to accommodate messianic eschatology and political ontology, is on the one hand a necessity, such that it works directly against the Hegelian concrete universal in its totalizing rationality, yet on the other, because it is the state of Israel that has access to the transcendence of messianic justice, the pre-ontological status of the demand establishes the certainty of one identity as arbiter of who is a face, in the same way that the radical doubt plaguing the thinking self establishes Cartesian subjectivity as arbiter of truth. But, and this is where my own radical theology or my own theological thinking for a thinking that does not disappoint comes into play. One is never purely undone or pure in her conceiving of the idea of the infinite. One is always in and of language, in and of the world, in and of a material history. While in theory the Messiah points to the ecstatic dimension of the self and does not only happen in response to this or that situation of suffering, traverses historical time, is not therefore presumably issued from the order of event, and furthermore, while history and politics are arbitrary, nevertheless, Levinas also argues that it is the Jewish people who have experienced the arbitrary violence of historical events. And it is thus incumbent on the Jewish people to reconcile the particular with the universal. It is, to quote Butler, their task, their fate, itself necessary, which remains indifferent to particular historical events, such that this ahistorical fate grounds Levinas's argument in favor of Zionism as a historical and contemporary reality, end quote. Or as Butler continues, quote, Zionism becomes a fate that exercises a certain necessity in history, end quote. From the vantage point of a secular theology of language, anchored in a radical materialism, the pre-ontological status of the ethical injunction is deeply problematic. Clearly, even for Levinas, it fails in retaining the status once it passes over into arbitrary historical time through an exceptional catastrophe befalling one people. Indeed, as already pointed out, Butler makes a similar point when she shows how in Levinas, quote, pre-ontological responsibility is the same as the essence of Judaism, end quote. In Arendt's sense, the command not to kill that she invokes in her Eichmann in Jerusalem isn't legitimated because it is a divine commandment, but because it belongs and is respected by the people of the book in a universal sense. As she contemplates Eichmann's invocation of Kant's categorical imperative in the former's defense before the Israeli court, she tries to reconcile his decent rendition of the maxim with his actions. How could the principle of his actions, his involvement in the final solution, though he, as he recounted, personally never killed a single Jew, ever become a universal law? She proposes that to follow Kant's maxim would have required not merely the legality of murder, but indeed, the force of the imperative, a complete reversal of the command not to kill, that is, a conscious pre-legal internalization of the command to kill. The very possibility that a people could have been agreed on such a commandment defies not only Kant, but the very conditions of civilization as we know it. That is, we encounter the authority of the command not to kill, not in the face of the other for whom I become responsible, but in the cultural norms that transcends secular law, that in referring to a shared culture symbolizes a shared earth, that whosoever is born has a place under the sun. As Butler suggests in her reading of Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism, Arendt seems to establish an ontology of plurality. The plurality of any and all populations constitutes the precondition of political life, and any political state, policy, or decision that seeks to eradicate or limit that plurality is racist, if not genocidal. This is Butler speaking. She reminds us of Arendt's conjectured indictment of Eichmann, that he thought he could choose with whom to cohabit the earth. Arendt's banality of evil is born in the face-to-face with a kind of genocidal thoughtlessness. For Butler, reading Arendt, the moral choice in thought is grounded in physis as plurality, which always undoes the identity of the one, even that of the victim. But the question of the identity of the victim of genocide is made contentious through the injunction to remember. How is the victim grounded in plurality? Only if she is not a victim, or else we are either all victims or victims of the one true victim. Who represents the victim qua victim? I cannot say I am the victim. I cannot say I am the Messiah. I cannot say that the demand for my responsibility to the whole world defines me essentially without risking the erasure of the face to which I'm responsible. Judith Stein, who died at Auschwitz, was canonized for being a Catholic martyr, who as a Jewish convert to Catholicism could stand for the victim that we, the universal we, could all be. But it is not the universal we who was the victim. Such a gesture erases the particular identity of the Jews. In Berlin, there are different memorials for different victims of Nazi socialism: Roman and Sinti, homosexual victims, euthanasia program victims, and of course, Holocaust. But why couldn't one memorial suffice? And what is the significance of the difference between this proliferation of memorializations on the one hand and the continued denial of, and if not straight-out denial of, the imposed civic silence concerning, or the euphemistic historicization of the genocidal colonial discoveries of the Americas? Just as the modern subject, even as a cosmopolitan subject, is historically wedded to the European Enlightenment, is thus a subject whose incarnation as a consumer in a liberal economy is made possible through the racialization of slave, indentured, and unpaid labor classes from Africa since the 1600s and from the Americas starting a century prior, so too the first avowed victim of genocide is in the first place a European victim, in our imagined identities, that is. But the historical event as condition of an ethical vision, even one so beautiful as to make of God a beggar, ought to manifest a form of sacred transience, one that would neither revise history nor deny remembering. Before I am, you beg of me, so that coming to be and ceasing to be, I inscribe my invisibility. I affirm my instability. Who am I when you call on me but born of a plurality? My word, not my own, our covenant, my promise, my love. Coming to be and ceasing to be, where do I come from? but from you who beckons. I, a singularity only made from our wording of the world together. With you I share the story of my ancestors, this particular plurality that beckons me too, that lived for me, this imagined identity contrived from my history or in spite of it. You told me my last name is Armenian. There was a genocide. This is who I am, and I don't understand. A Christian people who comes from the resting place of Noah's Ark. An ancient people whose various dynasties spanned variously between the Mediterranean Sea, the Black Sea, and the Caspian Sea. A people with its own alphabet. Your aunt was born in Asia Minor, in what is now Turkey. Now you are French, like the soccer players living in a town called Lebanon in the Alabama of the Northeast, where some of your German ancestors fought in the Revolutionary War against the English. A daughter of the American Revolution. Who am I without you? I, this I, is never a solitary subject resting on firm foundations. I, mythological, historical, ancestral, rests on your word. I come from your word to me. They say there was no genocide. What happened was very sad and tragic, but there were deaths on both sides. They are denying you, the condition of my flesh and the arc of my becoming. You were the threat and the traitor, they say. A world pile of suffering. They killed you twice, once in your flesh, twice in your word to me. Thank you. Thank you for listening.
So, is your argument then that if we accept human plurality, then we can never particularize genocide? I'm wondering about the logic.
It's a difficult question, okay, and I understand where I am is uneven, coming to be and ceasing to be in that answer. The experience of the particularity of genocide is clear. At the same time, if it prohibits somehow speech of the other,
A
recognition of human plurality, which might have, it's difficult to deal in. Is it similar? Is it not? But traumatic suffering throughout history or to come. And I think that is where that particularism risks being reified and uncontrolled, and that's what I'm arguing against. For now. Yeah.
When we raise this kind of different genocides, it's of course in this kind of speech it happens this that certain things are repeated, and then people are not knowledgeable about so many other genocides that have happened. For example, just a little while ago, I first time heard that there was a much more bigger genocide than the Holocaust in Belgian Congo in the beginning of the Leopold II killing 10 million Africans. So this I didn't ever even heard. So what kind of like logic is with this kind of like certain genocides are
like that. exactly, right. So for me, the experience of encountering a certain gag order for speaking of certain genocides precisely in the name of other genocide is what I found. It's paradoxical. It doesn't make sense. And yet somehow this is happening because, one could say, is this how we memorialize? Or we can't help but speak one language. That language encircles us. So how do we undo that language that encircles us? We breathe, you would say, but how do you concede that even in your own certainty of the experience that you have, which undoes you totally, you're not even totally undone yet?
And then it's like this kind of like how Americans memorized the 9/11, which killed a little bit under 3,000 people, and then Americans go to strike back and they kill way more people, and that's not memorized every year, right. What they have, like, so it's kind of
right. And so I'm also arguing against that that view that you can only use that word genocide in those specific instances that meet the specific criteria that fit our image, because our image it's historically situated, and Homo sapiens committed genocide against other species, right? So this is, in some sense, who we are, and I don't want this to become a kind of false banality of evil type of reading, where we're all, all doing because there is particularity historically in how this happens, but in the misnaming, the injunctions, there's. I'm arguing essentially for not erasure of identity, but an understanding that these are imagined identities, even as we are victimized. And again, there's these difficulties between the victim and perpetrator, and we can break the distinction, and it becomes a horrible place to be. Right? I understand that. There's for instance, this person I mentioned, Yakura, doesn't like Primo Levi's gray zone because it blurs the distinction. I'm like, well, this is what it is, and that's where we are. And to just want to manifestly say that I can be on the right side, which is not even expressed as such, so that in my face-to-face with the ethical vision, I'm not even sure I am. I don't know.
I have two more questions.
Okay. Thanks for the lecture, and I think it gives a lot to think about. It reminded me when you coined this phrase, I think you did so, genocidal continuum. I think, of course, there are economies of violence, and there's always a quarrel about what is justified and what is not, and whether or not this is within the circle of violence and counter-violence, and whether or not there's intent behind genocide. So that was the problem with the original definition, of course. And I think it's not only about, and don't mistake the terms now, I have no better ones, I think it's not about these taken in terms of historic quantity, where you make a difference between different sorts of genocidal violence, which is, there figures Rwanda, there figures the Holocaust, and historians try somehow to do comparative research on that. Yeah? And they, of course, always try to decipher whether or not there is some order behind that, there is some expression of intent behind that, or if it simply appeared at some point. Yeah? Was there the Madagascar plan, or wasn't it? Well, about all that. Yeah, I mean, it is mass eliminationist violence, or it is genocidal. I mean, it's a political question, of course. Mm-hmm. Yeah? It's a political question about recognition, but it doesn't relieve us from the question to think a bit deeper and to say, well, we have these definitions and they're context sensitive, they're problem relevant, but we always detect new forms of violence that feed into this economy. And I just thought about, in terms of continuum, yeah, lots of research has recently been done on what has been termed genocidal rape. I mean, that's a specific form of genocidal violence that is very, very difficult to prove. It is very far-reaching in its effects. It destroys communities until nobody knows for how long. And still, it took, I think, until 2001 that The Hague court convicted, in that case, Serbians of so-called genocidal rape. It's a different situation, of course, but still it's about recognition. It's about recognition. And I mean, you can't go back to the Bible, where there is this distinction made between war and extinction war, which concerns the memory. So you could even go as far if it's about revisionism, because say, the Nazis had the idea to build, how did they call it, the museum in Prague, which was in fact to be designed as a museum of the final solution. So, well, okay, they would have memorized in some sense these people. Was that contradictory within the logic of genocide or not? Then you have, again, severe problems. And I think it's so many very, very difficult issues that pop up here that make the issue really, really a permanently contestable issue to be expressed. So for me, the question is simply, on the one hand, can we analyze these economies of violence that permanently disavow some kind of violence for some other to function? And that's the same with colonialism. I mean, colonialism was a kind of laboratory. You could think about Enzo Traverso, you could think about other historians who have demonstrated how Europeans created a war machine there. And they somehow it traveled back to Europe. It was 30 years war, and then the 20th century, the Bloodlands and so on. I mean, violence is somehow transformative, and it is difficult to grasp. But even more so difficult is the question how to judge it. And I think nobody saw it better than Arendt in some sense, because she really pointed at this difficulty. And she was the first who really saw, well, we don't have the categories to assess this. Well, who's a refugee? Who's a stateless person? Who's a victim here, in fact? I mean, no, just ponderings about what is not really a question, but I think this idea of a continuum is important because it somehow could perhaps free us from the necessity to universalize the singular. We have singularities. It's not about uniqueness. It's a singularity in the plural. And that's, in fact, even a Levinasian notion that I'd say. Thanks, anyway.
Thank you.
Should we take the last question, then you can have a final comment?
Yes,
Yeah,
try.
Well, thank you for your lecture. I will speak about genocide and about the reasons of the different evaluations and understandings. I think here the conceptual analysis can be very useful. And the first element which is important is by genocide that it is a ethically laden or marked concept. This is what people intuitively grasp it as a morally laden and also a legal science accept this as morally laden because it's defined as a crime.
That was intentional,
so
right?
It is ethically laden, and I will give you an example. For instance, the book of Joshua from the Old Testament. You know, many people say this is genocide, and some believers, Jewish or Christian, said, no, it's not genocide. Christian, why not? Why is the Holocaust a genocide and Armenian or whatever, Indians? And the answer is because the believer interpreted that this was a God's will. And God's will is, by definition, something good in Christian, in Judaic tradition. And of course, atheists or whoever doesn't disagree with this and say, no, this is genocide. So you have, for instance, if you would say, for instance, Nazism, this is first point. Second point is that, genocide is defined as an intention to eliminate one particular group, target group.
Mm-hmm.
But now here is the important distinction stressed by Barbara Cart. It's a wonderful text on genocide, philosopher. Contrary to widely spread conception that genocide is a physical death, this is wrong.
Mm-hmm.
The essence of genocide is a cultural death.
Mm-hmm.
A physical death is only one way or one kind, maybe, and the extreme form of achieving of cultural death.
Mm-hmm.
But it is not the most sophisticated, and etc., etc. And now, if you take some group, for instance, Nazis, and you say, is it a genocide if I have an intention to eliminate every Nazi and Nazi culture from the world? If you say no, because this is moral. This is not a moral. So this is second thing we must take into account: distinction between physical and that. So these things can help you to understand why people so differently evaluate and judge phenomena which are from the other side very similar.
Now, one thing I will say is that Raphael Lemkin's own intent in criminalizing the law was to make it punishable, right? Because he wanted to prevent repetition.
Yeah.
That was his main aim. And you're right about the cultural genocide.
But Lemkin's definition, this is my third point, I forget, and it's connected to Michael's meter. What is wrong with these definitions of genocide which are used? They want to make a list of groups which are the victims of genocide by legal criteria. And this is wrong. You cannot predict which social group can be a victim of genocide. And even there can appear in future incountable series of groups. They could be, and this is the problem with Lemkin's. But there was interest behind it, because they want the big forces, for instance, Soviet Union and so on. They want to block the politicization.
Yes, they locked that out of the definition. Understood, right?
But Lemkin is limited. We must change it, but the problem is with the lawyers, because I lecture ethics and faculty of law. And when I speak with lawyers and with one judge, say, look, what you say is impractical, I need the list of groups, and then I said, genocide or no. Otherwise, I am in the philosophy, not in the law. But I think this is larger. This is also the problem.
Thank you again.
Thank you.